warmth of Jamie's body and woke sometime later, snugly wrapped in his plaid. I stretched, alarming a squirrel overhead, who ran out on a limb to get a better view. Evidently he didn't like what he saw, and began scolding and chattering. "Oh, hush," I said, yawning, and sat up. The squirrel took exception to this gesture and began having hysterics, but I ignored him. To my surprise, Jamie was gone. I thought he'd likely just stepped into the wood to relieve himself, but a quick glance round didn't discover him. When I scrambled to my feet, the plaid clutched to me. I saw no sign of him. I hadn't heard anything. Surely if someone had come, I would have wakened, or Jamie would have wakened me. I listened carefully, but the squirrel, having now gone about its own business, heard nothing beyond the normal sounds of a forest waking to spring, the murmur and rush of wind through new-leaf trees, punctuated by the occasional crack of a falling branch, or the rattle of last year's pine cones and chestnut hulls bouncing through the canopy, the call of a distant jay, the conversation of a gang of pygmy nuthatches foraging in the long grass nearby, the rustle of a hungry vole in the winter's dead leaves. The jay was still calling. Another had joined it now, shrill with alarm. Perhaps that was where Jamie had gone. I unwound myself from the plaid and pulled on my shifted shoes. It was getting on for evening. We, or I at least, had slept a long time. It was still warm in the sun, but the shadows under the trees were cold, and I put on my shawl and bundled up Jamie's plaid into my arms. Likely he'd want it. I followed the calling of the jays uphill, away from the clearing. There was a pair nesting near the white spring. I'd seen them building the nest only 2 days before. It wasn't far from the house site at all, but that particular spring always had the air of being remote from everything. It lay in the center of a small grove of white ash and hemlock, and was shielded on the east by a jagged outcropping of lichen-covered rock. All water has a sense of life about it, and a mountain spring carries a particular sense of quiet joy, rising pure from the heart of the earth. The white spring, so called for the big pale boulder that stood guardian over its pool, had something more, a sense of inviolate peace. The closer I came to it, the surer I was that that was where I'd find Jamie. "There's something there that listens," he told Brianna once, quite casually. "You see such pools in the highlands. They're called saints' pools. Folks say the saint lives by the pool and listens to their prayers." "And what saint lives by the white spring?" she asked, cynical. "Saint Kilian?" "Why him?" "Patron saint of gout, rheumatism, and whitewashers." He laughed at that, shaking his head. "Whatever it is that lives in such water is older than the notion of saints," he assured her. "But it listens." I walked softly, approaching the spring. The jays had fallen silent now. He was there, sitting on a rock by the water, wearing only his shirt. I saw why the jays had gone about their business. He was still as the white boulder itself, his eyes closed, hands turned upward on his knees, loosely cupped, inviting grace. I stopped at once when I saw him. I had seen him pray here once before, when he'd asked Dougal Mackenzie for help in battle. I didn't know who he was talking to just now, but it wasn't a conversation I wished to intrude upon. I ought to leave, I supposed, but aside from the fear that I might disturb him by an inadvertent noise, I didn't want to go. Most of the spring lay in shadow, but fingers of light came down through the trees, stroking him. The air was thick with pollen, and the light was filled with motes of gold. It struck answering glints from the crown of his head, the smooth high arch of his foot, the blade of his nose, the bones of his face. He might have grown there, part of earth and stone and water, might have been himself the spirit of the spring. I didn't feel unwelcome. The peace of the place reached out to touch me gently, slow my heart. Was that what he sought here, I wondered? Was he drawing the peace of the mountain into himself, to remember, to sustain him during the months, years perhaps, of coming exile? I would remember. The light began to go, brightness falling from the air. He stirred finally, lifting his head a little. "Let me be enough," he said quietly. I started at the sound of his voice, but he hadn't been speaking to me. He opened his eyes and rose then, quiet as he'd sat, and came past the stream, long feet bare and silent on the layers of damp leaves. As he came past the outcropping of rock, he saw me and smiled, reaching out to take the plaid I held out to him, wordless. He said nothing, but took my cold hand in his large warm one, and we turned toward home, walking together in the mountain's peace. Okay, and the other bit is from another chapter, but